Oh, well, dear friends, welcome to the WAPPP webinar on the Airport PPP market in Asia. My name is Jacques Follin. I am member of the steering committee of WAPPP, the Association for PPP Units and PPP Professionals. Just let me share, before starting the roundtable, few webinar technicalities and present the sequence for this webinar. Just to let you know, this webinar will be recorded. You will have access to the recording of this webinar on the YouTube channel of WAPPP. The chat function will be open, but it will be only for technical matters. So please use the Q&A option if you have any question, and I hope that you will have questions. In terms of sequence of event, we will start with a quick presentation of the panelists. Then we will have a presentation of the Airport PPP business in Asia, and just to have a look at what is the situation and what is the potential pipeline. And then we will start the roundtable, which will last around 60 minutes and will be followed by 15 to 20 minutes of questions. Just to introduce this webinar, it is very important to note that Asia has been historically favorable to the development of public-private partnership in the airport sector. Many countries, such as in India, you will see we have a lot of people coming from India in this webinar. Many countries such as India, Philippines, Japan, Indonesia, and Cambodia. I remember Cambodia was one of the first ones in Asia. They have launched significant programs to attract private sector to develop their airports. In this respect, you will see in the presentation of Kair that Asia stands out from the other continents with more than 45% of passengers in the ASEAN region having traveled using airports, benefiting from private sector involvement, although it represents only 15 airports in the ASEAN region. Recently, a few transactions have been completed in Indonesia or have been launched in India and Japan, for instance, but COVID-19 pandemic has affected a lot the traffic in Asia. So the objective is to understand what is the situation post-COVID, what will be the future of Airport PPP in India, and if the market, if the banks, if the environment for Airport PPP is set up to develop Airport PPP in Asia. So let's try to answer to this question with our panelists, and let me introduce each of you, starting with women. So we have Shobana Venkataraman. Shobana, could you raise your hand? Shobana? Okay, hi Shobana. Shobana has over 20 years of experience in infrastructure development and finance. She has been with the International Finance Corporation, IFC, which is a member of World Bank, since 2004, where she has been advising governments on implementing private infrastructure projects in the energy and transport sectors, including on airports in East Asia, Pacific, and Middle East. Prior to IFC, Shobana was a senior associate at Infrastructure Finance Group, a boutique project finance advisory firm in Washington, D.C., where she advised project sponsors on structuring and financing infrastructure projects in Africa, Europe, and Middle East. Danielle Bircher. Hi, Danielle. Danielle is Managing Director of Zurich International Airport, which is a global airport holding covering a portfolio of airports in Asia, Latin America, and Europe. I mean, Zurich Airport has been developing over the past 20 years a significant portfolio of airports worldwide. Danielle, before being Managing Director of Zurich International Airport, has been also managing Zurich International Airport Asia. He also acts as chairman of Yamuna International Airport Private Limited. I hope I said it correctly, which is the Indian SPV dedicated to the building of the new Greenfield Delhi Noida International Airport, which is an incredible project which has started during the COVID period. So you will tell us more about this project, Daniel. Maximilian, Max, I'll call you Max. Hi, Max. He's based in Singapore. Max is the Business Development Director, Asia Pacific for VINCI Concession. Maximilian leads all the development activities in the airport and highway sector for VINCI Concession in Asia Pacific, including developing airports under government project, PPP project, and M&A transaction. Well, just to let you know, VINCI is today known as the number one, the world leader in airport PPPs with a portfolio of 49 airports. Maybe it's been increasing in the last few days. I don't know if the Brazilian airports are in the Manaus group is included in the 49 airports, but they are all spread over Europe, Americas, Asia, from Brazil to Cambodia, including Gatwick in England and Osaka in Japan. Welcome, Max. You have Rajesh. Where is Rajesh? Hi, Rajesh. Rajesh is the Chief Executive Officer in charge of business development, GVs and subsidiaries at GMR Airport Limited, which is the holding company that oversees development and functioning of airports in India and abroad. GMR Airport, just to let you know, is an airport holding company with an extensive portfolio of airports PPP, including concession of Delhi International Airport, Hyderabad International Airport, Goa International Airport, and there is one which is quite difficult for me, which is Visakhapatnam, well, another airport in India. It's tough for me to tell it, but GMR Airport has also airports in Philippines, in Mactan and Cebu, airports in Greece, Heraklion International Airport, and more recently, the Medan International Airport in Indonesia, which has been awarded during the COVID period, which is also an excellent performance. And you've been with the GMR Group since 2007, if it's correct. And the last one, Dr. Vasudevan. Usually people tell you Vasu, so I will call you Vasu. Vasu is based in Bangalore in India. He leads the aviation practice for KPMG in India, and he is also the global sector lead for KPMG airport business worldwide. And so he has an excellent experience in PPP worldwide, including in Asia. And he advises governments, airport owners, operators, and aviation stakeholders on policy, strategy, finance, operation, and transaction-related solution with a sharp focus on PPP, if I understand well. So Vasu has been working more than 20 years in the transport, aviation, and airport sector, and he has a significant experience in countries such as Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam, Bhutan, Qatar. So I will stop your experience. Thank you, Vasu, for being among us. So, as I told you, prior to engaging in this roundtable, I would like to ask Mr. Mirza Kair. Where are you, Mirza? Hi, Mirza. To make a presentation on the existing pipeline of airport PPP in Asia. Kair is a member of Modalis Airport Hire, which is a WAPPP partner for the airport chapter. So the floor is yours, Kair. Kair? Hello?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good morning and good evening, everyone.
Thank you, Kair.
Thank you very much, Jacques, for the introduction, very kind introduction. And I think I'm in great company with esteemed panelists. So very quickly, I think what we thought would be useful is to give a very quick overview of the state of play of privatized or concessioned airports in Asia, and also potentially some of the potential pipeline. So very quickly, data from Airports Council International suggests that, of course, Europe remains the front runner in terms of where most of private sector participation in airports is, over 3/4. And South America is moving very quickly, up to 60% or even more. But Asia is not that far behind. Nearly 45% of pre-COVID traffic was through private sector participation airports. Middle East 13, Africa 11, and North America still at slightly early stage. So very quickly, I think we move on to just touch on one of the themes, which is in India. So quite a few existing airports already, which are participating via PPPs or privatized position. Some of them in the last 12 months include Noida Airport, where Daniel is involved, and also the secondary transaction of GMR Airports, where ADP has emerged as a significant shareholder. So a lot more airports as well being invested in or led by the Adani Group. And in process or in a potential pipeline, I think there are quite a bit more coming up via the government-owned AAI airports, as well as potentially, I think publicly available information suggests that there's a secondary stake in Hyderabad available. Of course, just to highlight as well that there are other things happening around India, but a lot of it seem to be early stage or more construction opportunities rather than outright privatizations. Moving on from India, I think we are also very interested in Indonesia, excited, where not only the privatized Batam Airport has announced originally a new operator developer, but also Medan has been awarded to the GMR joint venture. So I think the market is awaiting news on Lombok Airport, which is probably at the award stage, and as well potentially updates on both Bali Airport's duty-free and Komodo Airport, which initially seemed to have been at MOU stage. Moving forward, I think the success of the award of Medan Airport gives greater impetus to AP1 and AP2 and the holding company to look at more privatization, albeit the current structure in Indonesia seems to be preferring up to 49% investment. In Japan, over the last few years, there's been quite significant privatizations. So apart from Kansai and Kobe, Sendai, over the last 12 months, I think we've seen Fukuoka and Hokkaido. Interestingly, I think Mitsubishi is also involved in the Hokkaido Airport Group, but potentially a different part of Mitsubishi. And the market is also looking forward to potentially Niigata Airport either being tendered out or being awarded at some point. There are also airports outside of these three large geographies. So I think in Thailand, for example, a lot of it, although it's part of airports of Thailand, Utapao, which is Pattaya, is also being expanded, if you will, in stages now, post-COVID. And in Philippines as well, I think we'll see a little bit more developments. So they're already the privatized Cebu Airport, Clark, which is operated on an O&M contract. And there are also airports in Cambodia, Myanmar, which are in various forms of JVs or consortiums. In process, as mentioned, Thailand, we could be seeing a few more being added to the AOT portfolio. And there are reports of potentially Laos, Philippines, and Cambodia, either or not awarding new airports. Potential pipeline, I think we've heard of potentially unsolicited offers through Malaysia and as well as Central Asia. So this gives you an overall look for what the Airport IR database has on the radar. Some of it do move forward, some of it sometimes take a step back. But it's something that we are very happy to engage with market participants. Okay, so that is more or less from us to kind of set the stage for the experts to discuss in terms of where the industry is moving, maybe where it's a little bit faster, where it's a little bit less fast, and what maybe the industry participants would like to see moving forward from the market and from regulators and financiers. Thank you.
Thank you, Kay, for this presentation, and very interesting. I think that this presentation could be made available to the people attending the webinar. So we will record your mail and your mail address and circulate it to you right after the webinar. So let's start the roundtable, and let's start the roundtable with if you can turn up the presentation, the sharing of the presentation. Okay, thank you very much. And let's start this roundtable with a question which has been in the head of everyone for the past 2 years. The COVID-19 crisis, the pandemic, has severely affected aviation activity in Asia due to severe air traffic restriction. And I think these restrictions are still ongoing in many countries which are still locked, such as China. How did the existing concessions survive to this difficult and complicated episode? How did the government and banks in the various countries where you have been, you have concession have been reacting? And the other question in relation with COVID-19 is, did the existing concession scheme ensure the continuity of the activity and were able to restore acceptable levels of profitability for the concessionaires? So I would like to start with Maximilian. I know Vinci has concession in Japan, in Cambodia. Maybe you could be able to tell us first also on this COVID crisis recovery.
Yeah, sure.
So.
Thank you, Jacques, and thanks for having me. Overall, I think your situation was actually very different, also from country to country, and every country, reacted differently, had different COVID situations, and had different ways of dealing with the situation. Also, looking at airports being more domestically or more internationally driven. So this is one important point. On our side, we are present in Cambodia and in Japan. We also had different situations, of course, in both countries. Key, of course, is that as an airport operator, most importantly, we provide a public service under the concession contract. So we basically never stopped operating. Not only, of course, providing essential connectivity to the country, which is one very, very important aspect, but also, of course, continuing the operations, always, of course, having in mind the safety of the people working on the ground, of the passengers, and this in a constantly evolving situation with different kinds of lockdowns, entry restrictions, quarantines, testing regimes, etc. So it was, I think, it was quite challenging. All assets have, of course, suffered a lot, especially based on and also now going forward, it's still the case, that you have entry restrictions for Japan, for example. Cambodia, it's not the case anymore. But also looking into the future, we have, of course, the big challenge of the Chinese travelers not coming back as of now to our airports, especially for Cambodia, but also for Japan. To summarize, yes, it was very challenging. Profitability has suffered a lot. It's, of course, also a give and take in a long-term concession relationship that you have with your grantor. And we have tried our best to adopt in the situation based on the situation that we found more or less on a day-to-day basis in those countries.
Thank you, Max. Rajesh, GMR is involved in India, highly involved in India, but also in Philippines and more recently in Indonesia. Could you tell us about how this situation, the COVID situation, has been managed in your airport concession, and do you think that the government and the existing airport PPP schemes have been able to help you in ensuring a continuity of the activity and restoring acceptable levels of profitability?
Sure. Thanks, Jack, and thanks for having me as part of this panel. No, I think as my fellow panelists mentioned, the situation has been different in different countries, but I think one common thing which we saw, a very significant dip in the air travel. That was one common thing which we saw all across the globe. And that situation continued for almost close to about 2 years. And as we see now, the recovery is in sight, so things may start looking better. Coming to your point on how did we manage the concessions? I'm talking primarily first for India in respect of our own airports. See, we had to basically resort to various cost reduction, cost optimization measures during this period, with almost starting with some 90%, 95%, and initial 3 to 4 months were practically there was no traffic. So we had no option but to get into those cash flow optimization measures, and we had actually deferred some of our capex plans and without kind of affecting the operations. We had to also look at in case of Delhi, where you have multi-terminal operations, to bring that as single terminal operation. That's how one could have optimize the cost part. So, but then such measures are only give you some relief in terms of the burden on the cost. With the large infrastructure projects like airports, where you have significant fixed costs and things like even interest costs and all that. So there is no way, even with those cost optimization measures, you will be able to stay afloat. So I think a majority of our own area of operations, we had to actually dip into our cash reserves, to stay afloat. So that's how this whole thing was managed. This is more from the overall cash flow management point of view, if I say. On the business side, yes, on the operational side, all that RT-PCR testing, all that stuff, you have to realign whole of your the way you were operating. So initial few months were like hit and trial and making things happen. But I think eventually with a good coordination amongst various agencies, including government and government machinery, airlines, I think we could able to tide over that difficult phase in terms of operations, I would say. Coming to your point on did government or the concessioning authorities give any relief to us? So there was some relief in the way of some deferment of revenue share for a specified period. But I mean, beyond that, even the government couldn't do much because they had to take care of lesser privileged sectors like medium and small enterprises, and all that government support and funding was to go for that side. So aviation industry that way couldn't get much of support, but on the operational side, I think government machinery worked tirelessly in coordination with various stakeholders. I would say that's where the government support came very handy. In terms of banks giving any support, yes, banks, again, there was some relief given by banks, but that was again primarily directed towards medium and small enterprises, and those businesses who are part of airport ecosystem, they did able to get some relief over there. So that's coming on what kind of support banks would have given. As regards any support coming in from the concession agreement on the business continuity, I think the concession agreement did have provision of force majeure, but then one could have got some relief over there, but that's the only way one would see at concession agreements. In terms of retaining or containing profitability to that extent, for these kind of large infrastructure projects and at that level of operation, profitability, it was not possible. So I think it was more to see that how do you stay afloat. That's what I would say.
Thank you, Rajesh. Daniel, your situation of Zurich is a bit different because you're starting a new project, a new PPP project. And I would turn the question a little bit differently. I mean, how's your, launching the project and during the COVID period has been, how did you find any difficulties in closing the financing, in starting the project? I know it's a great ambition, and what the government helpful in developing this project during a period which was not easy for any one of us.
Yeah, thank you, Jacques. We actually closed the initial deal in 2019, so that was, I would say, in the height of the last upturn in the aviation industry. So, and then at an early stage, we started engaging with lenders in India, and I would say surprisingly, we did not face a lot of trouble to close the project financially initially. And I would say this is linked also to the perception in the industry in India. First of all, India is a huge domestic market, and most people have seen COVID as a very severe impact, but not with long-term effects. And I think we'll talk about this afterwards. So the trust in the industry, the trust in the project, a project in a catchment area of 30 million plus has been robust and has helped us to close this. Obviously, when COVID hit, then Zurich and our other airports, discussions came up: is this the right thing? But as one often says, you should invest in difficult times to be ready in the good times. So that is our belief, and we have been firm in this commitment and have received the support by the government to close most of the critical issues. We are about to start the construction, so so far it has been a difficult but a clear path ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Daniel, for your question. I have a question which is also in relation with the situation, or the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the war in Ukraine, are bringing a lot of long-term uncertainties to the air traffic, especially for international, I should say intercontinental traffic. Do you all see these uncertainty as a handicap for the deployment of PPP project in the ASEAN region? Let me start with Vasu. I mean, you have a global view on the PPP business, and could you give me your views on the future and the impact of the air traffic difficulties on the future of PPPs?
Thank you, Jacques, and firstly, thanks for inviting me on this panel. Great to see some of my colleagues and friends as co-panelists as well. And these are very interesting times as we bounce back from probably the biggest black swan event in the history of aviation, at least. Just focusing on that question, Jacques, I think fortunately, while of course it has had a direct impact on fuel prices, which I think is the biggest setback for the industry as a whole, because airlines, as your principal client for airports, certainly have had a bad run, not just because of COVID, and also because of consistent cash flow issues, which Rajesh referred to as well, which have been far more acute in the airline business than in the airports business because of the way it's structured. But notwithstanding that, I think the way I see it is that it has not had too much of an impact on traffic coming back to our airports, not just in India, but also in other parts of Asia. It has, of course, raised the costs of doing business, at least to the extent that some of these connections which go through Eastern Europe, or the fact that some of these carriers have to take now longer routes and burn more fuel, seems to be impacting the profitability of carriers, and that's not good news anyways. But I think in terms of the overall impact, notwithstanding the ongoing war in Ukraine, there seems to be, I think, some consistency in terms of how the market is bouncing back. The fact that passengers continue to throng back to airports, especially the frequent flyers. You see airports again crowded during peak hours. Luckily, India has been spared the impact of a fourth wave. We just hope it stays this way. And I think from a long-term standpoint, even if we take a view for the next 24 to 36 months, we think that the story looks good enough for future growth. While, of course, there's a big question mark about what could happen in terms of the supply chains, as well as the cost of operations if the war in Ukraine continues. Jacques?
Yeah, thank you very much, Vasu. Let me ask you the same question, Shabana. IFE is looking at all the PPP situation in Asia. What is your feeling with respect to development of airport PPPs in the current situation with air traffic being difficult to fully restore?
Hi, thanks, Jacques, and thanks for inviting me on this panel. Good morning, good afternoon to all the audience. So, I'm from the group within IFC where we advise governments on PPPs, how to structure PPPs, so not so much from the financing side. And what is interesting to note is that right before the pandemic, around 2019, we had several projects in the pipeline where governments were asking us for help. And then as soon as, the pandemic struck, I would say all the way up to the end of 2020 and up to maybe middle of 2021, not a single project was moving, at least the ones that we were involved in, because of all the uncertainty, it was just felt that this is the wrong time to come back, even though concessions are very long-term, which we tried to explain. In mid-2021, what happened was obviously the overall improvement because of the vaccination situation, the rise in domestic passengers, which are very, very important in all the large Asian airports. I think pretty much all of them, China, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines, very high share of domestic traffic. All of that sort of encouraged governments to at least, dust off the plans that they had been looking at before and trying to resurrect these plans. Another important factor was, just the fiscal situation of the governments. Because of the pandemic, they had to spend so much on other areas that they didn't really have anything to invest in the state-owned airports or for CapEx going forward. And they knew that very soon, once the pandemic is over, you're going to need new terminals, better runways, you're going to need new airports. So that's when they really started coming back. And I think as a result of that, we're seeing several new airports coming on. Of course, the two big ones, the Indian ones, that we just discussed, Navi Mumbai and the Noida one, but those had been in the works for some time. So it was a question of taking it over the line. In terms of absolutely fresh airports, I think we saw some that were closed in the middle of the pandemic, especially very small airports like Almaty in Central Asia. Then we're seeing in this East Asia region, we actually saw Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, start its concession. Dili, Timor-Leste is going to start a program. These are all very small airports, but I think it goes to illustrate that governments of all kinds are now looking more than ever to PPPs in this sector. And I think this is going to continue. Of course, we have to watch the space if there are any additional variants of the virus, the fuel costs because of the war situation, and also the airlines' health themselves. I think in East Asia, we've seen some of the airlines having to cut their fleet sizes extensively, Garuda, for instance. So you wonder how they would perform a hub role anymore. But despite all of these things, I think what we're seeing is that almost every government is at least looking again to the plans they had before.
Thank you, Shobhana. Let me ask to the operators the same question. How do you see the situation for the country where you are already involved in? I mean, do you see the traffic restriction impacting the energy to develop new PPPs, or do you think the envy to develop new PPP being the appetite to develop new PPP being a little bit smoother than before? Daniel?
Yep, thank you. I really couldn't agree more with Shobhana on her analysis. Maybe I can add a couple of additional points that I see. So first of all, the availability of funds has been an issue, and especially on the side of operators. I mean, there is still a lot of funds, capital, seed fund, infrastructure, pension fund, but we have seen there also a move away into maybe renewables and other sectors with certain question mark whether the industry is sustainable, but maybe that is a short-term issue. So that is definitely one of the things. Then the second question obviously came up, and we have been also confronted with that. So how about the robustness of private investors' financial capability? Because as we heard, a lot of operators looked for state support in a difficult phase. Clearly, with 80% or 70% of fixed cost as an airport operator, you have a challenge, and that sort of caused certain doubts on this. Then the third element I thought is the renewed tendency for state intervention. So we have seen in many countries extreme state intervention, and that obviously has caused also the question of how would these states then deal with concessions, unless a state has a very robust PPP legal framework, such as maybe Brazil and India would be, in my view, the most advanced ones. The question always comes up, are you as an investor then safe, and can you really invest and get your returns? And last but not least, that question of new isolationism. I mean, we have, especially also in Europe, heard now many calls for renewed evaluation of multilateral agreements. So this all has sort of cast a bit of doubt on the question, is the infrastructure or the airport sector the right sector to invest? But I'm totally confident with the growth predicted, the travel to continue, that the infrastructure and airport investments are required, and most of these states have huge debts now, so I don't think state funding is the option to go ahead. So we will see renewed PPP projects coming up.
Oh, thank you very much. Rajesh, how do you see the impact of the difficulties in air traffic on the coming PPP?
So yeah, thanks, Jack. So I think last 2 years have been, everything went into a kind of suspended animation mode, because of all the uncertainties around traffic recovery. But I think with now, with traffic coming back, and these are all long-term concessions. So my personal view is that we would see some traction now taking shape on the PPP side. In fact, the very example of Indonesia, where Medan and Batam, these are the two concessions which got concluded during this difficult time. So I think we should see now PPP projects again coming back into the market. And in India, those 13 airports, 6+7, hopefully we should see some momentum gaining on that side. My overall view is that we should with recovery of traffic, with things stabilizing, we shouldn't be seeing these projects to be starting again. As regards Ukraine, whether Ukraine war, I would consider that to be more of a regional issue at this moment, rather than this impacting PPP projects at large. So whilst the projects in that particular region may, and which are largely connected to that location. So, but otherwise, I don't see Ukraine might have a significant impact. But the issue on the fuel prices can have dampening impact. So one will have to keep an eye on that, I would say.
Okay, thank you, Rajesh. Maximilian, Max, you're over seeing the market in Asia. How do you see the impact of these difficulties in traffic?
I mean, I agree with my fellow participants that the traffic will of course recover. The question is, of course, in which period of time. Also, a lot depends on China. Of course, outside of India and domestic traffic there. And overall, the infrastructure gap is there. So the risk is rather that the traffic recovers potentially quicker than the governments thought. The infrastructure lack and gap is there. Airport needs to be expanded, increase capacity, etc. And then when you look at the lengthy procurement processes, certainly Shobana knows about that as well. We have been looking at Medan. It took years to get this project over the line for the Indonesian government. And if you look at that and you combine, so you will have a real problem, I think, for governments being hesitant now and then traffic picking up and again running into this big infrastructure problem. And I think that should be, at least from my point of view, even though I don't think it will move very quickly, but from a government perspective, that should be they should have that in mind, looking at the future, especially procurement lead times, takeover times for the private operators to take over the airport, to start building and increasing the infrastructure, and this needs to be done very quickly once the traffic is back.
Thank you very much, Max. I have a quick related question. Usually, the banks are, financing the debt is essential for developing airport PPP and PPP in general. Do you see banks very happy to invest in airports, to lend funds to airports, to finance airports, or do you see them a little bit cautious with airport investment in this situation of where the traffic is not, the future of traffic is not clear? Although we know that domestic traffic will recover, we still have uncertainties on international traffic. We have uncertainties on business traffic because of the what we're doing, Zoom and new internet tools. How do you see the position of banks? Very quickly, maybe I don't know, Vasu, have you been talking to banks?
Sorry, Jacques, that was for me.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thanks. No, I thought Shobna would be able to answer that better, one of the operators, but I'll take a shot at it because I've not been talking to banks directly. I didn't have to. But then let me give you my point of view. I think obviously there is some cautious optimism about the future. But I think what has fundamentally changed, Jacques, is that, you know, while banks are willing to lend money to large infrastructure projects, not just for airports, I think the view on bankability has obviously changed in terms of the focus that COVID has brought into, you know, conventional view on traffic risks or financing risks, right? And I think it's for good reason as well. While I don't think there's going to be a shortage of capital, especially debt for these projects, particularly where these assets are regulated and they provide an assured return. As Rajesh mentioned, these are long-term concessions, and therefore banks will take a long-term view on bankability of these projects. So I think the focus has come back to how concession agreements of the future can address these traffic risks better, and maybe that's an evolution in the right direction, if you ask me. And maybe Shobna can throw more light on it. That's number one. Number two, I think willy-nilly, it has also brought in a sharp focus for operators like Zurich and Wanshe and even GMR on how they can better design these terminals to minimize capex. That means, you know, a greater focus on capex efficiency, clearly, in terms of what technology can do today, what operational procedures, what reforms in operational processes can do today in terms of minimizing the footprint of airports. And again, also on the OpEx side. And again, I think with greater use of tech, with more non-aero assets becoming part of airport PPP projects globally, and now the so-called emphasis on non-PAX revenue. So non-aero traditionally used to be, I think, one big source of funding, which used to give comfort for lenders and investors. But now there is also the concept of operators looking at non-PAX, people who don't fly, but come to these airports as destination, you know, to spend an evening or, you know, to engage in some activity, which also generates significant revenues in some parts of the world. And Bangalore is a good example. Singapore has shown that it can happen very well. So I think some of these elements and some of these innovations which have come into the whole PPP ecosystem are good for the industry. I think they're also going to make banks a little more willing to look at these assets in terms of financeability. And again, as I said, I think the fundamental issues of how traffic risk or the financing risk can be dealt with during the construction phase is something that governments can help address in some way by taking a fresh look at historical concession agreements. Jacques?
Thank you, Velu. You mentioned Shobana. So Shobana, I know you're not on the bank side of IFC, but well, although there's a Chinese wall, I'm sure that you have your views on how banks are reacting vis-a-vis the traffic risk and the financing of traffic risk.
Sure. So I think, I mean, from what we're seeing, it doesn't seem that banks are hesitant. They are looking for good projects and taking a long-term view. I just have never heard anyone, even the most stringent credit officer, saying that, oh, you shouldn't invest in an airport project because there's a COVID pandemic going on and traffic. I mean, they may challenge the projections a bit more, asking questions like, do you really expect that high case to ever work out? Or do you expect to see some long-term dampening of business travel, those kinds of things? But it's kind of more a question of how do you size your debt service coverage ratios, etc., based on what case. It is never, oh, it's too risky to invest in an airport. I think we're also seeing a lot of refinancings. I mean, some are kind of forced because there's no choice, but this is also an area where lenders are being quite active. I mean, you know, Jacques, yourself about the Medina Airport restructuring followed by refinancing that just happened recently. So we're seeing, you know, more of that happening. We're seeing concession terms being extended by governments, and therefore some of the financing being restructured that way with tenor extension. So I think in short, we are not seeing a big difference. Maybe one point to add, and this is again about the small airports, which we like to talk about because we're a development finance institution. But when you look at some of the very small airports like Mongolia, Ulaanbaatar, Dili, you see that they have an innovative kind of financing model, which is a hybrid financing. So it's not only commercial banks or commercial multilateral lending. This is actually a mix of concessional loans, which could be from bilaterals, like in the case of Mongolia, or multilaterals, most likely in the case of maybe Dili. Combined with private financing and private participation by private airport operators. So I think this is something we'll see more of in the very small airports in times to come.
Oh, thank you, Shobana. Just quickly, my dear friends, operators, how do you see the situation? Maybe start with Max, quickly, and banks.
I would also agree with what has been said. So the interest is still there, potentially, more scrutiny from the lending side, but the interest is there and will continue to be there. So
okay, thank you.
I don't see a problem.
Thank you, Danielle. Banks are still following you on airport PPPs.
Yeah, I would agree. We definitely had reasonable scrutiny, and sponsorship securities are more there. The conditions may have changed a bit, but overall, I mean, for the bank, this is always a good business. So that's why they're still interested.
Thank you, and Rajesh, for this good news. Are you sharing this good news?
Yeah. So Jack, absolutely, I'm with my fellow panelists. We have reached to a stage. The last 2 years have definitely been tough, but we have now reached to a stage where the quality of underlying asset is the one which will determine. So I don't see there's any issue in terms of getting the finances for airport development. In fact, the fact that Jewar, Navi Mumbai, and our own Goa project achieved financial closure in the last 12 months or so is itself a reflection of there is a good appetite for airport projects.
Yeah, thank you for this good news. Another question which seems to be interesting on the future of PPP in the country where you have that have been the country that have been already involved in the PPP market. I would like to ask you about your experience about the airport PPP in those countries. I'm saying Japan, India, Cambodia, Philippines, Indonesia. How do you see potential improvements to existing mechanisms of airport PP, existing model of airport PP? What would you like to see in this PPP model? And do you see government accelerating airport PPP program in countries where you've seen already PPP? I'm just talking about Japan, India, Cambodia, all these countries. Maybe Danielle?
Yep. So for us, the question often is, what are the government objectives, and if there are clear objectives for the PPP project, it is often much easier than when there is some, let's say, blurry mix of attracting capital, but on the same side protecting incumbent state-owned operators. So we see some of the states that have these mixed models, and that makes it then reasonably difficult for the foreign investor, be it an operator or an investor, to find a clear role. I think, and once this is clear, and also the legal framework, and the development of the legal framework. I mean, we still have a lot of countries in Asia and Southeast Asia where majority ownership is not possible. That obviously requires a different way of investing than when majority is there. So these and then the dealing with force majeure event, we've seen that now through COVID. Before it wasn't so accentuated, but now this is an important element, whether it's clear, whether the risk sharing is clear. And I would say the third element is also how is the overall risk sharing with regards to traffic in these concessions? Is it purely on the operator, the investor side? Is the state ready to develop a model that takes this into account, fluctuating traffic flows? And the last element is the question of investments. Often as an operator or an investor, you're faced with a fixed investment deadline or capacity investments irrespective of the demand. So it's always preferential to have models that are demand driven and that don't have fixed or predefined investment steps. That makes it also easier to finance the whole thing. So I see possibilities, but I think in many markets we are not at this stage where it makes it that easy for investors.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. When Rajesh, do you share this view that PPP model should evolve in terms of sharing traffic risk, in terms of new models for the more flexibility in the investment, more flexibility in the deadline for investment? I mean, do you see that changing, and do you see government having a strong appetite for continuing their PPP development strategy? I mean, you're based in India. India is you're actually involved in 3 major markets where PPP. Where you have PPPs in India, in Philippines, and in Indonesia. Do you see government changing in their models?
Jack, my view is, I think let's talk about India first. India's PPP model has already reached a certain level of maturity. In the last 1.5 decades or so, we have gone through the complete cycle of, from where we started. There have been issues, the initial teething issues, and having reached to a certain level of maturity. Now, what has happened in the last couple of PPP bidding you have seen today, the payments to the concessioning authorities are now on a per pax basis. So to that extent, yes, some amount of risk is taken care of, but will we see government moving towards where the passenger risk or traffic risk is completely taken care of? I see that may be a challenge. I will not see that to be happening at least in the coming future. But yeah, that's an important element which for an operator to take that risk, and especially which I just mentioned, the investment are so significant, so where the fixed cost is almost 60-70% of the overall cost of operation at fixed cost. So how is that to be taken care of? That's something which I think one will have to really start working with the authorities. There has to be some relief, some way out for that. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist today.
Thank you, Rajesh. Max, how do you see that in your country, in Cambodia and Japan?
I mean, for those 2 countries, of course, the situation is very, very different. In Cambodia, we have the concession since 1995, and this has very well developed over many years. Japan is, of course, much more recent, and of course, a completely different setup for the country. But both experiences have worked very, very well. It has also, of course, taken a certain amount of time, and I think that is important to really understand. Also, looking at other countries, I mean, for India, the first privatization was many years ago, and the regulation has evolved over many years to something that is was much more interesting and acceptable as now as it was before. So I think overall there has to be, the development has to take time, that the overall setup works out. It's of course different for bigger countries and for smaller countries where you only have a very few assets, but we see that of course in those very established markets. But then when you look at Indonesia, Thailand, etc., for the last two projects, for example, citing also the projects that were in the presentation for Utapao or for Medan, where you have the regulatory system is still very much in flow. You don't really know how to deal with that going forward, and that is a big challenge that I think also for private investors, because the risk appreciation has changed to a certain extent after COVID, based on that event, but also now taking into account all the other regulatory risks in addition. So I think this is something that has to be considered. But overall, again, every country is managed very, very differently. And I think the key is also to that those markets, for example, Indonesia or Thailand, move into the same direction in terms of PPP.
Yeah. Thank you, Max. I'm looking at the market in Asia. We've seen that some countries are starting to be involved in airport PPPs. We've seen the first project of airport PPP in Thailand, in Utapao, and we've seen few countries interested in developing airport PPP. I understand that Nepal, Bangladesh are looking for this. I understand also that Laos was looking for this, but we see also big countries not that far away from airport PPP, but not stepping in. Like Vietnam, and China is still away from PPP. So out of the current situation, what are the obstacles to implementing airport PPP project in these countries? And do you consider government organized or willing to move forward with a PPP strategy? Do you think also that there are political threats against the PPP scheme for airports? Although these countries have a lot of PPP in other sectors than airports. I would like to, let's start with Shobhana, as you're covering Asia.
Yeah, I think we're seeing various types of structures in Asia. It's most are straight concessions, but with some differences, like we heard from one of the speakers earlier about different levels of government participation, ranging from 26% in India to 50 plus or 51% plus in Indonesia, etc. On the other hand, we're seeing sort of a partial privatization in Thailand. I think in the case of Vietnam, they are probably trying to find the best model that might work for them. You do hear of different, I think a couple of years ago, I heard about putting everything in a holding company and doing a partial privatization or strategic sale of that. But I think that's no longer the case, and they may be looking at concessions again. From what just what I've seen in the media, I don't have any first-hand knowledge. So I think some countries are still looking at the various ways this has been done, seeing which has been most beneficial for governments and trying to adopt.
Well, thank you, Shobhana. Vasu, do you have your view on the situation of these countries?
Yes, thanks, Jacques. And yeah, I agree with Shobhana Manning. I think the good part is that notwithstanding COVID, we have seen a lot of action on the ground in many of these countries as well. I think most governments have taken the view that airport assets will need to be built to address the future demand, especially in the Asia Pacific region, because of the importance it holds, for various businesses, including e-commerce, which is quite big in this part of the world as well. So I think the sentiment remains positive. And as we discussed earlier, banks seem to be open to financing these assets because they have certainty in long-term returns even today, notwithstanding the blip that we've had. These structures are going to determine really how risk-prone or risk-friendly these assets are going to be. And I come back to my earlier point on not just contracts, but also the overarching regulatory framework in some of these countries. The smaller countries, of course, are still emerging as new PPP markets, and therefore there is an ability to learn from some of the other mature markets which Rajesh spoke about in terms of what works well, given past experiences. That's one, I think, area where a lot of effort needs to go in, so that we can at least get the sync between government administered regulation and contractual structures, and that they don't work at cross purposes. That's number one. And we've seen some of those issues in a large market like India in the past, and therefore there is that learning. Number two, I think from a financing standpoint, it is also important that some of these governments are able to commit some skin to the game. And I think whether it's 26% or 51% or even something lower, sometimes in some parts of the airport's business, for example, cargo, which could possibly be driving the bulk of the revenues in some of these airports, could actually be, driving profitability a lot better. And from that standpoint, I think it's also important that governments have a better skin in the game in some of these assets. And lastly, I think it's also important to distinguish between large assets and smaller assets, because some of these large airport assets, which we tend to have a bias for, obviously have a better ability to monetize the asset because of the nature of the traffic and also the profile of people who would spend at these airports. But I think we also need to look at a different model for some of these smaller assets, which are going to be important in some of these other countries that we referred to, because they also provide essential connectivity and enhance economic activity. So I think the models will differ, but there are a lot of learnings that we have now because of the success of PPPs. Overall, I think the intent and the need for PPPs will only grow because one, we've established that there have been significant success stories of assets which have been done through the PPP structure. And two, I think given the larger concern on government's exposure, which Rajesh referred to, not just in a country like India, but in other geographies as well, there is going to be a need for financing, which obviously needs to come from the private sector in some form. Jacques?
Thank you, Vasu. Rajesh, I know you're looking at the or other countries in Asia. What is your view on the countries that are having difficulties to step in the airport PPP mood?
Yeah, sure. So I think the PPP scenario, it's very countries dependent. There are internal situations, how ready is the private organizations to participate, what's the strength of public enterprises, what are the policies, and more important, the political will to go in for public-private partnership. In fact, a couple of days back, me and Khair, we were there in Saudi. We clearly see an intent on the part of government to now go in for PPP in a bigger way. So I think this whole thing about countries embarking on PPP route is more to do with the political will and the will of the government to move on those directions. That's the way I would rather. There are enough of success stories of PPP. Countries can just simply follow those models, but it is all dependent on the political will of those countries and the internal situation thereof. That's the way I would rather put it, in terms of where all this can be rolled out. coming to your point on China and Vietnam, I will not again call these an exceptions. I think all these points hold good for these countries also. So, but I would say some of these things are more like exceptions, but not as a threat to the whole PPP thing. For word as one, I'm saying. So that's my view.
Thank you, Rajesh. And Daniel, how Zurich is looking at the situation in these countries. Are you looking at the small countries, or are you looking at Thailand? Are you looking at Vietnam and China? And what is your view on the development of Airport PPP in these regions?
Yeah, we have been looking at most countries in Asia, and I will not talk about the objectives because I agree with my colleagues on that this needs to be set out. There may be two other points that are important, namely the role of the state-owned airport operators. And we have good examples there. We have, even though we talk about Asia, but I could recommend everyone to look at the models in Brazil, both from a development or evolvement of the PPP framework over time, taking into account all the risks and things, but also on a clear strategy how to deal with the state-owned airport operators. And I think that's often one of the obstacles or one of the factors that lead to concession models that are not easy to handle. And I think the clearer the government is about the role, are these state-owned operators going to disappear? Will they focus on certain activities, or how is it? The easier the concession framework is. And then the last point obviously is how are the governments looking at airports as strategic assets. In some jurisdictions or governments, this is a transportation infrastructure. In some governments, they have a much more strategic defense-related meaning, and that obviously also has an impact on the appetite of these governments to open up for private investments, not only foreign but private investment. I think that's the first step. So definitely we look at these markets, but the specific markets that you mentioned, we have doubts that the frameworks are ready and mature enough for meaningful investments, let's say it like this.
Jacques, if you permit me, I just wanted to add one point to what Daniel just referred, which is important in terms of the state role. I think in mature markets, including India, because we've now had more than 20 years of PPPs, the role of the state will obviously come down eventually, and that's already happening in some form because the government has announced a national monetization pipeline, which includes the divestment in major airports, including the one which Rajesh is running in Hyderabad. So I think we are going to see that happen more often, where the state has played its role in the initial phases of the whole PPP program, and therefore there's more confidence in the private sector, running the assets better and with better governance. But I think in some of these newer markets, like in Vietnam or Thailand, that's something that will need to evolve over time. And therefore, I think in those countries, the state will still have an important role to play. I think Daniel's point is valid that it can't be interventionist. There has to be sufficient freedom given to the private investor, whether it's local or overseas. And that's where I think the nature of concession agreements come into focus.
Okay.
Jacques,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Vadu. I have now a question which is in the spirit of the what you see in most of the PPP in the world. Today we've been talking about climate change. We have been talking about transition energy. I mean, what for you? Environmental pressure, the desire to decarbonize airport, and awareness of sustainable developments, and are all part of the airport environment of the future. And do airport PPP schemes in Asia take this concept into account, and how they still make an effort to reflect these developments in airport PPP project in Asia? But to make it very simple, I mean, do you think that your airport scheme today are already set up to take into account these environmental considerations and the climate change consideration, or do you think they still have to progress in that way? Shobhana, let's start with women because it's part of the sustainable development goals.
Okay. Yeah, I would really be interested in hearing from the operators. My own view is that Asia, especially, I think this is where a lot can be done. These are some of the largest airports. You also see this is the region that's most vulnerable, or one of the most vulnerable to climate change. You have many airports in Asia being built on reclaimed land, because in order to be close to an urban center, you just don't have land available. And that obviously makes it more vulnerable to flooding, etc. So I think this is the region where really the operators have to step up and plan. Not only operators, governments and operators have to plan and design airports. And it makes good business sense because you're talking about a 25, 30, 35-year concession. All of those scenarios, extreme climate events, et cetera, they are definitely going to happen. So, it's better to do it now. You'll save money doing it now rather than later. I don't think it's being done enough in Asia, to be honest, other than a few, maybe Japan, Singapore, et cetera, which are anyway following kind of European standards. We just don't see that in the emerging markets. And I hope that, the private operators can bring in some of these best practices. Oh, just maybe one last thing would be to say, if we start seeing more of green financing coming in and being offered to these kind of airports, I think that would be very helpful in giving very tangible incentives.
Thank you, Shobhana, for your view. Rajesh, I mean, we've been talking about India, so give me your thoughts.
Yeah, sure. So Jack, I think this whole focus and emphasis on ESG has been kind of gaining momentum, and so what we are now increasingly seeing, and I can talk about our own airports, we are setting up solar power generation, in our airports, and sustainability is definitely also gaining focus. So irrespective of whether these have been mandated as part of PPP scheme or not, I think the world is moving towards that. So whilst still these are early days, but as I see going forward, we'll see more and more emphasis on sustainable and sustainability, as well as on ESG. On your point, whether the current PPP scheme does have any such requirements, yes, those are there, but I would not say to the extent one would expect, or the way currently the world is moving towards. In things like best practices on construction power, how are you going to be using the sustainable material? All those things are there as part of the current PPP scheme, but maybe these will further evolve as we'll go forward. But as I said, irrespective of that, I think there is already an awareness on the part of the operators to move towards that.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much, Rajesh. Vasu, what is your view on the ESG impact on the PPP models and PPP schemes, PPP agreement, and how is it taken into account by governments?
Yeah, I think that's one of the two pillars that I think will redefine, in some sense, the future of concession agreements. It's probably not found, mentioned in some of the existing concessions in a big way. But along with tech, I think sustainability initiatives will have to play a big role for reasons mentioned by Shobhana. And therefore, I think even in countries like India, while we have had the experience of working with concession agreements in the past, I think it's time to relook at some specific provisions or obligations with regard to ESG or sustainability commitments in the concession agreement itself. Of course, Jacques, you know very well that every time we talk about emissions, somebody from the aviation sector will put up their hand and say, look, we know that we only contribute 2% of the global emissions, as far as GHG is concerned. But notwithstanding that number, I think it's important that, airports lead the way. And it's already happening in a big way. We've had several examples in India itself. Cochin Airport was the first to be recognized for, making the entire airport carbon neutral in Kerala. And we've seen airports like Delhi and Bangalore get near to net zero kind of situations. And Daniel, I know for a fact that he is working very hard with his team to make sure that Jewar, being another large greenfield airport, will in some sense be net zero even if, when they go live in a couple of years time. So I think there is already recognition of the fact that climate impacts are going to be significant. Airports have a big role to play, notwithstanding anything that's obligated under CORSIA or local regulation. Airports are voluntarily making these investments. The impact that it could have on costs in some sense will need to be evaluated. This is more aspirational, as we can see, but I think it will also have some bearing in the cost of doing business in the future, depending on which country you're operating in. And I think that needs to be covered through some, explicit concessions in either future concession agreements or the policies that government will need to come out to make sure that, there's much more momentum in what airport owners and operators have voluntarily committed to do.
Thank you, Vasu. Very quickly, Daniel, I mean, you've been mentioned by Vasu about your challenge to and your willingness to make the Noida an example in terms of ESG. Give us your view about increasing the ESG awareness and consideration in the airport PPP.
Yes, I think I always like to differentiate between a good business practice, sustainable development, and ESG. And excuse me if I'm here a bit frank, but I feel a lot of these recent ESG initiatives are a lot of greenwashing and putting a lot of things in paper and which has no real impact. I mean, let's face it, we have a problem as an industry. The airports are one part of it. The main lever to have sustainable aviation is fuel, and I think it has to be a joint effort to provide sustainable fuels. Now, as an airport operator, we cannot do that in such an extent, but we can try to reduce our footprint, and that's what we will do for the new airport. That's what we do in Zurich. That's what we do in Brazil. And there are different approaches to that. Obviously, a greenfield airport offers more opportunities to design systems, buildings from scratch, bring new standards of energy saving, production of energy as well, and that's what we will apply there. But I'm a strong advocate that we really work together as an aviation industry to make travel, not to limit travel. I think that's the wrong approach, because human mankind have been traveling for 4,000 years, but we have to make traveling sustainable. And the big approach would be, for me, fuel, and we do our part as airports as much as we can.
Thank you, Daniel. I mean, just to tell you about what you mentioned about fuel, providing sustainable fuels, including in the future hydrogen. WAPPP will have in June is an annual conference, and there will be a session dedicated to airport and energy transition in the aviation. And you will know more about it, and we will inform all the speakers and all the participants about this session. Max, how you see the Airport PPP scheme changing with the ESG consideration?
I basically concur with what has been said. There's integration in the current PPP schemes to a certain extent. which will evolve over the next year, certainly. But most of it is actually voluntary, done, I think, by all of the different operators to adhere to ACI, decarbonization targets, etc., and move at least what the airport industry can influence into the right direction. Fully also concur, of course, with Daniel that it's a wider aviation industry approach that is actually needed to decarbonize travel.
Yes, thank you very much, Matt. Well, I would like you to before getting, I have a couple of good questions, and I would like to spend few minutes about it. My understanding is that you all feel that there's a strong future for Airport PPP in Asia. There's improvement to be made, but the governments are on the way to make improvements. Some countries still have difficulties to set up the right scheme to get in the Airport PPP. But well, the COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine are not stopping the appetite for Airport PPP, which is a good news. Just let me ask. I have a couple of interesting questions. There's one on cargo. Somebody asked what is the shares cargo is taking in the Airport PPP scheme. We've seen an increasing activity in air cargo in the last months, last 2 years. So how do you see the cargo impact on your Airport PPP? Maybe Rajesh in India.
Yeah, sure. No, I think one thing which this last 2 years have actually taught all of us. See, cargo, one I'm talking about from the airlines point of view first. Cargo was a known strategic, used to be a known strategic business line for the airlines. But what they realized during this COVID-19 is that become their main source of revenue. So yes, definitely cargo is an important element, and in fact the government of India has put a special focus on how do you increase cargo business per se, and what are the various enablers needed for that. So definitely as we'll go along, and there's already a clear focus on that, and we would see a greater emphasis coming on cargo, and that cargo becoming as equally important like the passenger traffic business in India.
Yeah, thank you, Rajesh. Maybe Daniel in Noida, how do you see the airport, the importance of airport cargo? Is it changing your plans for the future of the airport?
No, it's not changing. We as a greenfield airport, we have a lot of land available, and that is definitely a strategic element to plan for seamless cargo. But I also, on the other hand, have seen cargo as a very cyclical business. I can remember 4 years ago working in Brazil, we were not able to convince airlines to operate because there was too much capacity on the seas. So I think whereas COVID definitely, and I agree with Rajesh, has shown the importance, this can also change quickly again when the maritime capacity is back again and the prices for air cargo will go down. So it's a cyclical business, but it is an important business overall.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. And last question about the regulatory aspect of Airport PPP. I mean, we've seen dual till, single till, hybrid till. I mean, different mode of implementing regulation in airports. So just I would like to have Basu view on whether there is a trend for typical single till, dual till, or hybrid till in the Airport PPP in your region. Basu, I will restore you.
Sorry, yeah, I was on mute, Jacques. My apologies for that. Yeah, and that's one of my favorite subjects, Jacques. Thanks for throwing that question at me. Well, you know, it's been a long learning curve for us. And I think there are several lessons that have been learned. But I'll just try and summarize 3 or 4 points which I think should be considered. And I've seen a lot of comments in the chat box as well with regard to the subject. So I think fundamentally, we have regulated strongly by contract in the past. And I think it's time to now look at a new partnership model with or without equity investment by the government, where instead of looking at it purely as a financing approach, these contracts should focus on the partnership part. And by which I mean that there should be enough room for flexible interventions on both sides and room for negotiations as well, which we haven't seen in the past. Most issues have gone for arbitration or have been pending in regulatory tribunals for very many years, increasing costs of administering the contracts as well as the cost of regulation. So I think that needs to change fundamentally. The other big change that needs to come, as I mentioned earlier, is also to look at what is the most efficient tariff framework. I think we've again started with a hard touch approach, and we've had very mixed approaches to different assets, which I think needs to change. We need to have parity on all elements between different assets because they are going to be competing in the future. And for example, if we do move to a predetermined tariff framework, and I'm talking particularly in the context of India, there is obviously room for moving to a dual till, because I think the fundamental concern of all regulators, economic regulators globally, as far as airports are concerned, is that they need to ensure reasonable tariffs for users eventually, whether it's airlines or passengers. And I think that intent can be well achieved by having a predetermined tariff framework. Daniel did mention about the Brazilian model. We can probably learn a few things from there, Philippines as well. And therefore, dual till is possible in those structures. I think lastly, it's also important to look at what can be done to help airport operators maximize revenue other than passengers. And cargo, as was pointed out, is a big source, and airports in India haven't monetized it enough. Recently, the minister did announce the intent to triple the cargo throughput in India, which everybody believes is eminently possible. But I think that would require a fundamentally different approach to handling cargo at airports and also the regulatory framework, even though it's largely light touch today. For example, we all know that in some of these big markets, airlines made a lot of money because of a drop in capacity, but those margins could not be shared with the cargo terminal operators or the airport operators equally or equitably, for the simple reason that they were administered by a different regulatory framework. So maybe those are some areas which the government could focus on in terms of straightening the contracts, so that there is more equitable share of margins or profits. And there is also fair and transparent administration of these contracts, which ensures that everybody makes money.
Well, thank you, Vadu, and thank you all. I mean, this has been an impressive roundtable. I think we could continue to speak about Airport PPP in Asia for a long time. I've been impressed by the number of professionals that have joined the webinar. And I thank you for having taken the time to participate for these interesting questions. And we will try to answer the questions that haven't been answered yet during the presentation. So there will be a recording of this video. It will be available on YouTube and LinkedIn. I will circulate it also by mail to the link by mail to all the participants. And thank you all. And it was a pleasure to have you speakers and participants to this roundtable. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you.